This birth week got me reflecting on what I've learned since turning 30 in the last 7 years. And I tell you, I've learned a lot. My 30 so far has been so freeing and healing in ways that I can't even begin to describe to you. But it didn't just happen. A lot of it came through a process of unlearning some things that sounded really great and really spiritual, but ultimately were just religious sounding poisons that kept me in bondage to all the insecurity, shame, and mind games that I had even before I was a Christian. So as I was reflecting, I realized that the lies that held me back are likely lies that are holding you back too. So for this message, and to celebrate turning 37 today, the day of this broadcast, I thought it would be fun and impactful to review the 7 churchy lies I had to unlearn for real healing. And this message is packed, so we're going to get right into it here. The first churchy lie I had to unlearn is that I am saved by grace, but maintained by performance. This one was never necessarily said outright by anyone, but it was kind of an unspoken principle that kept getting reinforced in different ways and times in my life. You see, I came to my personal relationship with the Lord at 16 years old. And anybody who knows my story, if you've been with me for a while, you know that at 16 I was a shy, extremely insecure kid, longing for acceptance, longing for love, fearing that my every imperfection made me someone that upset God. But one Wednesday night, January 2001, I walked into this new kind of church that I never knew existed. And I heard about a Jesus who loves and who is personal and who has power. And well, I wanted it all. Nobody had to twist my arm into saying yes to him, especially since I was told all I had to do is believe. And you know, that's the truth. Romans 10:9 says, if you declare that Jesus is Lord with your mouth and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, that you will be saved. That's grace right there. It's the forgiveness, acceptance, and approval of God despite what you do. So that moment, when I said yes to Jesus, I was saved by grace, and I knew it. But here's the thing. That didn't automatically change feelings and fears in me that had been built up over 16 years at that point. Yeah, I accepted my past was forgiven, and it was, but I still struggled with things in me that weren't changing. So I came to believe that keeping God happy with me was contingent upon my performance. That it was all contingent, this Christian life was all contingent upon me fixing myself up. So I turned the faith into a glorified self-help program. The Bible became nothing more than an instruction book to help me get right and stay right with God. And then as I got into college and shortly thereafter, I got into some circles and environments where it was understood that revival and a supernatural visitation from God and a church service was dependent upon getting cleaned up enough for him to show up. So the first decade of my Christianity, I'm thinking that I've got to work on myself to stay good with God, and I've got to be good enough before God to convince him to do miracles. Well, that kind of living will send a person crazy because it's impossible. If you could quit everything that's bad for you, if you could fix every aspect of you that's damaged, if you could turn from and stay turned from every ounce of sin in your life, then you could have achieved the law and Jesus would have never had to die. But God knows you couldn't. God knows you can't clean yourself up enough to be worthy of his presence. He knows you can't fix yourself enough to be good with him on your own merits. That's why he sent Jesus to do it all for you. That's why you're not saved by grace and then maintained by performance, but you are saved by grace and maintained by grace. Had I kept on reading Romans 10, past verse 9, I would have seen that. Because in verse 10 it says, "For it is by believing that you are made right with God." Made right. That's not a behavioral thing. It doesn't say you do right. Made right is an identity change. It's the cutting out of your sin nature. That's what saves you. It's old becoming new. And once you've been made new and made right by God, nothing you can do or not do can change that. As Paul also told the Romans, nothing can separate you from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. And that means no person, no past, no present problems, nothing. There's so much more that I could say on that topic, but I've got 6 more churchy lies that I've got to help you unlearn. So we got to get to number 2 here. And it is, second lie, spiritual warfare is a fight. When I was under the impression that I maintained God's love and acceptance and approval by my own performance, I felt everything that came against my efforts was the enemy trying to sideline me. At that time, to me, everything was spiritual attack, which I had to attack back with greater force. So there again, disciplines of the faith became the way I would do it. Victory came through hours of prayer and days of fasting and specifically worded prayers of deliverance, giving until it hurts. None of which, to be clear, are bad things. I mean, they all have their place. But to me, and to many others I've found, we turn those things into weapons to defeat the devil. But in time, I grew frustrated because they weren't working to maintain the victory that I thought they would. And that's when one day, while reading Ephesians 6:10 through 17 about the armor of God, the Lord showed me something simple that exposed all my fighting as futile. And at 29 years old, this became the premise of my first book, Silence Satan. Ephesians 6:10 says, "Be strong in the Lord and His mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all of the strategies of the devil." Now, I don't have time in this message to teach on this entire passage. I did a few weeks ago. I talk about it in my books. But God highlighted the word stand. And He said to me, spiritual warfare is not about fighting a devil who is defeated, but it is about standing in the victory of the one who defeated him. I should have known. Colossians 2:14 through 15 says the devil was disarmed and defeated on the cross. We don't have to do it. When you believed and were saved by grace, there's nothing more the enemy can actually do to you. He can't defeat you or destroy you. He can only deceive you. So for the Christian, it's lies and deception, which are the enemy's only strategies. So we don't fight him with all kinds of means and methods hoping for victory. No, we engage in spiritual warfare by simply standing on the truth of who we are and what we have in Christ. It's truth that confronts lies and deception. When your mind is fixed on truth, the enemy's lies can't take root. And I promise you, that changes everything. While we're on this topic of the mind and the devil, let's talk about deliverance. Because it's the third churchy lie I had to unlearn. And it's that deliverance happens instantly. Now this one sounds really good. And I wanted to believe it. Especially those of us who are or have been part of any Christian denomination or movement that really emphasizes the power of God. We know God has the power to do whatever He wants in an instant, absolutely. He spoke the world into existence. The Bible is filled with many miracles of blind eyes and deaf ears and devils leaving in an instant. And I never want to minimize any of that because God does it all today just as He did back then. But those are miracles and those describe exorcisms. And that's different from deliverance. See, I didn't understand the difference many years ago. I had it all confused and kind of lumped up in one and the same. I expected that with one prayer or laying on of hands or one fall on the floor, and I should walk away instantly delivered. But here's the thing. What we've been through, the environments that we're raised in, the things we've heard and experienced over and over, those things physically wired our brains in toxic ways over a period of years. So even if a devil is expelled from you, even if a symptom is instantly gone, that doesn't change your way of thinking so that you suddenly make better choices or think better thoughts or say better words overnight. It just doesn't. What does change you is what Paul outlined in Romans 12:2, which is to let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. You see, deliverance is the process of being free from something, of being changed into a new person. But as Paul says there, it's a process that happens by changing the way you think. I'll explain it this way. A lot of us in seeking change, we begin to work on the outside things, to fix that, stop this, quit that, maybe start that. But bad behaviors, bad moods, bad language, whatever, those are all products of bad beliefs. You can maybe stop a bad behavior or hold your tongue for a while, but unless you get to the root beliefs that are influencing those things, they'll just continue. So deliverance is the process of taking down those bad beliefs by applying truth to them in a way that over time actually reprograms your brain to think correctly, therefore believe correctly, therefore behave correctly. We go back to that previous lie that we covered. Jesus has provided the victory. Your deliverance to live according to that victory happens as you grow in confidence of it. That's the truth, and that takes time. I think on these things journal. A lot of you have that. That explains that process. You might need to reread that first chapter, and then the rest of it actually leads you through the process in a 30-day period. Much more depth than I can cover here, okay? But continuing this theme of deliverance and victory, let's move on to the fourth churchy lie I had to unlearn, and it's that victory is the absence of struggle. Again, this one sounds great. It's what we crave. And stories of complete change, 100-degree change in experience is what the church tends to only promote because it conveys the power of God and inspires awe and wonder in people. We think. But as I've traveled across the country to speak in churches and individually to countless people, all in the throes of struggle, you know what I found? When we only share testimonies of 180-degree change, healing, or deliverance, yeah, we are awed for a moment. But then, later, many people feel shamed by the lie that that kind of story is the only evidence of God's work. Therefore, they think, if I still struggle, if I still am not healed, if I still have this in my life, then it must be because I don't have enough faith, because I've upset God, He's mad at me, on and on and on. But while reading through the Apostle Paul's experience with what he called a thorn in the flesh, God spoke something to me that reframed my view of victory. If you know Paul's story there in 2 Corinthians 12, he's talking about a difficulty. We don't know what it is. Could have been a person, could have been a thing. Some difficulty that just wouldn't go away no matter how much he prayed. Then amazingly, Paul goes on and he says he'd rather boast about his weaknesses than all the super spiritual things that happened to him. And he had lots of things. I mean, he was caught up into heaven and saw visions and all kinds of things. But he said he won't boast in that. I'll boast in my weaknesses. And to be honest, I wrestled a long time with that. It just didn't seem like victory as I had learned. But that's when the Lord dropped a word into me. He said, "My grace in weakness is equally as miraculous as removal of the weakness. I said, how can that be, Lord? What is miraculous about something that doesn't change? He said, grace is the miracle of my presence, upholding human frailty with a strength to press through what the enemy meant to subdue. Now, I don't expect you to understand the magnitude of that statement all right now. It took me a while to process it. But the gist is this. While stories of 180-degree change, healing, deliverance, while those are all necessary and should be told, what equally needs to be shared and celebrated are the stories of those like Moses and like Gideon and like Paul, who remained faithful to God amid difficulties that didn't go away. Again, there's so much I could say about this. But real victory on this side of eternity is not the absence of every problem. Jesus himself said, in this world you have many trials and tribulations. Real victory is knowing that our trials, tribulations, problems, and imperfections don't define us, and they don't have to limit us or disqualify us. Hear me. It is okay to be a work in progress. And besides, I promise you, more people are inspired by any progress you make amid difficulties than they ever are by progress you make without any. Unlearning this next churchy lie was huge for me, especially as I grappled with my own imperfections. It's the lie that I only need God. As many of you know, I'm naturally an introvert. So especially back in the day, it was easy for me to isolate myself and take on everything myself and not include anybody in it. Plus, it sounds spiritual and strong to think, I only need God. So all of that just made it really convenient for me to hide in shame and never let anybody into my life. And yes, it's true that when it comes to your salvation, your acceptance, your vindication, your approval, all you need is God. But believe it or not, God didn't create you just to need Him, nor did He design the healing process to only include Him. Most of us know that just after Adam was created, God said it is not good for the man to be alone. So He made Eve and He established the family unit. But God's declaration there, by the way, isn't a law of marriage, as if that's the only way not to be alone. Jesus was single, but He wasn't alone. Paul was single, but he wasn't alone. Single doesn't have to mean alone. Family doesn't have to be only biological. The point of this verse, as it applies to us New Testament believers today, is that God created us for relationship. There are certain things we get from other like-minded people that God didn't design us to get from Him. And one of those things is a kind of healing. This is why the Apostle James in James 5:16 says, confess your sins one to another, confess your faults one to another, so that you may be healed. Well, it's not talking about your back pain going away or your arthritis being dissolved. It's talking about a deeper healing, an inner healing, which is the healing of shame, the belief that who you are is wrong. And there are many ways that confession to someone else heals you. One is that confessing your faults, imperfections, weaknesses, whatever you want to call them. It's like taking a pin to the growing pressure of shame, to all of the enemy's taunts, where he's saying, hold it back, hold it in, keep it to yourself, otherwise people will reject you. It's popping that pressure. There's an incomparable freedom when you can arrive at the place that you can share with a trusted someone those things the devil says disqualifies you. But secondly, when you're able to share some of those things and you hear a loved one say, so what, I love you anyway. That's a kind of healing salve like none other. I mean, Hardly anything can compare to that kind of thing. But this isn't my idea. I mean, this is God's idea. He's the one that put the principle in the book. And He knows what He's talking about. You don't need a lot of people. You just need one or two trusted someones to be real with, to heal with. All right, I got to move on. The sixth churchy lie I've had to unlearn, and this one might really shock you for a moment. But hang with me. Hear me out. The lie is overcoming sin is the greatest goal. I know I've got to really explain this one. I'm not recommending sin. This isn't me saying to be complacent or nonchalant about it. You can't out-sin God's love. You can't out-sin God's grace. Sin's not bigger than any of those two things. Sin's not bigger than God. So this, again, goes back to the first lie I mentioned. It's kind of foundational for everything. If you believe your greatest goal is to overcome sin, then you become so self-focused on what you're doing or not doing that you end up doing it all the more. 1 Corinthians 15:56 says that law gives sin its power. Look it up. It's like when you keep telling a child, or an adult for that matter, not to do something, they end up actually doing it. Well, when your every waking hour is consumed with not failing, not falling, you get back in performance mode. And you end up falling because your mind's consumed with it. You go in the direction that your mind is consumed with. That's why law doesn't work. That's why Jesus came. As I said at the beginning, for so long I saw the Bible as a self-help manual to stop sin, and ultimately that's not what it is. The Bible is the story of God's relationship with a broken people and how through love He fixed them, how through Jesus He dealt with the sin problem. 2 Corinthians 5:19, I quote this one a lot. For God was in Christ reconciling the world to Himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. It's dealt with. So my recommendation to you, which brought me more freedom and healing than just ever trying to stop sin or fix or quit or turn from it all, is to focus on your relationship with God and how He loves you and who you are in Him. Let that consume your thoughts. It's right believing that leads to right behaving. A lot of us battle because we have that backwards. We're trying to stop sinning while we're still thinking of ourselves as a horrible sinner. I know maybe that sounds kind of holy to think that way, but it doesn't work that way. Freedom doesn't happen that way. Okay. Seventh and final churchy lie that I had to unlearn. Your weaknesses disqualify you. And this is one of those things, again, that I'm not sure anyone said outright, but I mean, definitely the enemy said it. But in the church world, it's kind of one of those things that's implied. You know, we often have these litmus tests or these checklists of you got to do this and be this in order to be qualified for this. If you were to listen to a replay of my life's prayers, you'd hear a lot of, how can I, Lord, when I don't have the money, I don't have the energy, I don't have the connections, I don't have the ability, I don't have the life of someone else. It was a predominant insecurity in me that something in me or about me didn't measure up to some standard, and therefore I was disqualified in some way from God's plans. It took me years to believe that my quirks weren't imperfections that counted me out, but that they were qualities God crafted, or at least redeemed, to count me into some plan that He had before I was even born. I love the prayer of David in Psalm 139. In verse 13, he says, you made all the delicate inner parts of my body, and you knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Well, that right there reveals that God's behind much of our uniqueness. But then David goes on to say in verse 16, "You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed." So that means even your brokenness, the things God didn't intend, He saw and accounted for it all in His plan for you. All the complexities and complications of what make you you. So when He calls you, who you are in the moment of the call is qualified for that call. Gideon's story, I mentioned him earlier, but Gideon's story is what really opened my eyes to this. He was the self-described weakest of his tribe. And he was hiding in fear when God called him to rescue the nation of Israel. And at that point, right after God called him, God didn't tell him to go get strong and fix himself before he can go rescue them and take on the enemies. No, God said, go with who you are and what you have. I am sending you. Now, Gideon tried to get strong. He built a massive army of 30-some thousand warriors. But God said, no, embrace the weakness. Winnowed down the army to mere 300 men. So that's what Gideon had to do. I suggest you read the story for yourself, but to make a long story short here, Gideon and his army won the battle against Israel's enemy, but it wasn't really those 300 men. I mean, all they did was shout, blow horns, and break some clay jars. I mean, it was kind of a wacky thing. God was trying to prove, and He did prove, that it was His grace, despite their weaknesses, that won the victory. His grace and weakness was always part of the plan. And it's the same for you. Stop focusing on who you aren't and what you don't have, and surrender to grace. It will carry you. Through it, God will use your life. I'm telling you, He will use your life as a living illustration of His truth, that He works all things together for good. And trust me, there's nothing more satisfying than that. And there's nothing that you are more qualified for. Because for that, God doesn't need your strength. He doesn't need your performance. He doesn't need your perfection. He just needs your surrender. Now finally, let me say this. Because it's taken me 30-some years to get to this, and sadly, many have lived much longer and still haven't gotten it. The goal of the Christian life isn't to become many of the things that many have made it out to be. It's not to become a husband, a wife, a minister, a philanthropist, or even a better version of yourself. But the goal of the Christian life is to fully enjoy the gift given because of the cross, relationship with the God who loves you. Everything else that needs to be worked out works itself out from there in God's way and in God's timing. I promise you, it does. Are you in the middle of a mental, emotional, or spiritual struggle? Here's some good news. God has provided a way to beat that battle today. Yes, you have access right now to spiritual armor, complete with 6 supernatural weapons that ensure victory in any circumstance. Ready to powerfully access and activate this armor? I've created an in-depth interactive e-course to show you how. The Armor of God e-course includes 6 dynamic video lessons in which I reveal how to effectively use the weapons outlined in Ephesians 6 to radically shift from chaos to calm, fear to faith, sorrow to joy, and battle to triumph. It's an eye-opening, illustrated exploration of the armor of God that unlocks all the victory Jesus died to give you. This e-course isn't just something you watch, but it's an immersive experience with which you interact. Each lesson includes a 16-minute video teaching, a lesson guide with reflection questions and application tips, and a discussion forum where I interact with you. The Armor of God e-course is available for you to join in on today. Simply visit kylewinkler.org/armor to get started. And because the 6 lesson e-course streams entirely online, There's nothing you have to wait for to arrive. Begin instantly from any internet-connected computer, tablet, or smartphone, and continue at your own pace from wherever you are. You no longer have to be under attack, but you can live on the attack. And I want to show you the way. Join me now to discover how to access and activate the armor of God to beat your battles today. Visit kylewinkler.org/armor to get started, and I'll see you there.